It was a day like any other when Jamal, a 17-year-old high school student, spotted the wallet lying on the sidewalk. He was just a few blocks from home, walking back from the corner store when something caught his eye. A worn leather wallet, tucked between the cracks in the pavement. Most people would have kept walking, their minds too busy with their own lives to bother with someone else's lost item. But Jamal wasn't like most people. He bent down, picked it up, and glanced around. The streets were quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. He opened it carefully, expecting to find a couple of crumpled bills and maybe a few cards. Instead, it was stuffed with cash. More money than Jamal had ever seen in one place before. He hesitated, a moment of temptation flashing in his mind. But that thought was quickly replaced with a strong sense of responsibility. He had been raised to do the right thing, no matter how hard or tempting it might be. The wallet belonged to an older man named Mr. Henry, a local who had lived in the neighborhood for years. Jamal had seen him around, always polite, always with a kind word for the kids. Without thinking twice, Jamal made up his mind. He wasn't going to keep the money. Instead, he was going to return it. It wasn't his, and he knew if he were the one who'd lost it, he would want someone to return it too. Jamal set off toward Mr. Henry's house, clutching the wallet tightly in his hand. As he approached the old man's small, modest home, he could see Mr. Henry sitting on the porch, looking down at the ground with a furrowed brow. It was clear something was bothering him. Jamal hesitated for just a moment before walking up the stairs. "Excuse me, Mr. Henry," Jamal said, his voice a little shaky. The old man looked up, surprise flashing across his face. Jamal held out the wallet, and Mr. Henry's eyes widened as he recognized it instantly. "I was just about to call the police. I thought I'd lost it for good," Mr. Henry said, his voice full of relief. "Thank you. You're a good kid." Jamal smiled, shrugged, and quickly made his way back home, feeling a quiet sense of pride. He had done the right thing. Little did he know that one simple act of kindness would set off a chain of events that would change his life forever. The next day, as Jamal was finishing his homework, there was a knock at the door. He opened it to find two police officers standing on his porch, their faces serious. The officers asked if they could come inside and speak with him. Confused, Jamal invited them in, wondering what this was all about. Had something happened? Had he made a mistake? "We need to ask you some questions about a wallet you returned yesterday," one officer said, his voice stern. Jamal's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't thought much about it. After all, he had simply returned something that didn't belong to him. But the look in the officer's eyes told him that this was no ordinary visit. Something was wrong, and Jamal was about to find out just how wrong it all was. As the officers started to ask him about his whereabouts the previous day, Jamal's mind raced. What could they possibly be after? What had he missed? And why were the police involved in something as simple as returning a lost wallet? The tension in the room thickened, and Jamal realized that the story he thought was over was only just beginning. Was the old man hiding something? Was Jamal in some kind of trouble? The questions kept piling up, each more confusing than the last. The officers' questions only deepened the mystery. Had Jamal seen anyone else in the area? Did he know where Mr. Henry had been the night before? And most chilling of all, had he noticed anything unusual about the wallet or its contents? The answers Jamal gave seemed to do little to reassure the officers. In fact, they seemed more interested in his every word, as if they were trying to piece together something far larger than a simple case of a lost wallet. The officers told him they would be in touch, and left without offering any further explanation. Jamal was left standing there, stunned and confused. Why had this simple act of kindness turned into such a big deal? Was he being dragged into something dangerous? And what did the police know that he didn't? To be continued. Jamal sat back down on the couch, his mind racing. He had never been in a situation like this before. The police had come to his house over a lost wallet, a simple act of kindness that had somehow spiraled into something much darker. It felt like everything he knew about the world was suddenly being called into question. What was going on? Why had the police been so interested in a wallet that was returned to its rightful owner? He glanced at his mom, who was in the kitchen making dinner. humming softly to herself as she stirred a pot on the stove. Jamal had always been able to talk to her about anything, but this felt like something he couldn't even begin to explain. He wasn't sure if she would understand, and he didn't want to worry her more than necessary. The thing was, Jamal knew the neighborhood. He knew everyone, and everyone knew him. It was a small, tight-knit community where people looked out for each other, especially in times of trouble. But there was something different about Mr. Henry. Though he'd always been friendly and polite, there was an air of mystery around him. Jamal couldn't quite put his finger on it, but the older man's behavior sometimes seemed a little off. Maybe it was the way Mr. Henry would occasionally disappear for days at a time, or the fact that no one really knew much about his past. People didn't ask questions, though. He was just another face in the crowd. Until now. Jamal's mind went back to the moment he had handed the wallet to Mr. Henry. The old man had seemed genuinely grateful, but there was a brief flicker of something in his eyes. Something Jamal hadn't noticed until now. It was like a shadow, a fleeting moment of fear or maybe relief. What could that have meant? And why had the police cared so much about a simple act of returning something that didn't belong to him? His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Jamal jumped, startled by the sound. He quickly stood up and peeked through the window. The two officers from earlier were back. His heart dropped into his stomach. Why were they here again? Had they found something else? Or was this all just some misunderstanding? He opened the door, trying to mask the anxiety that had taken root in his chest. "Can I help you, officers?" he asked, his voice shaky despite his best efforts to remain calm. "We just have a few more questions for you," the first officer said, his tone still serious. "Can we come inside?" Jamal's mind was spinning. He hadn't even had a chance to process the first round of questions, and now they were back. What were they looking for? He stepped aside, allowing them in. His mom had already started to call out from the kitchen, wondering who was at the door, but Jamal waved her off. He didn't want her to get involved. Not yet. The officers sat down at the small dining table, the sound of chairs scraping against the floor echoing in the otherwise quiet house. "We need to ask you some additional questions about your interaction with Mr. Henry yesterday," the second officer said, his gaze intense as he locked eyes with Jamal. "Okay," Jamal replied, his voice barely a whisper. He was trying to hold it together, but the tension in the room was almost unbearable. He could feel the weight of their gaze on him, like they were trying to read something deeper than just the surface level of his words. "We spoke with Mr. Henry this morning," the first officer continued. "He confirmed that you returned the wallet to him, but there are some discrepancies we need to address." "Discrepancies?" Jamal asked, his brow furrowing in confusion. "What do you mean? I gave it back to him, just like I found it. I don't understand." The second officer took a deep breath, looking over his partner's shoulder before speaking. There were several large sums of money in that wallet, far more than Mr. Henry would normally carry. "We're trying to understand where it came from." Jamal's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't counted the money himself, but he knew there was a lot. Still, he didn't think it was anything strange. Mr. Henry was an old man. Maybe he had some savings, or perhaps he had received a payment for something. But the officers seemed to think otherwise. "He didn't seem like the kind of man to carry around that much cash," the first officer added, his tone almost accusing. "Did you notice anything unusual about the wallet when you found it?" Jamal swallowed hard. "No, it was just a wallet. Nothing unusual about it. Just had a bunch of cash and some cards. That's all." The officers exchanged a look, and Jamal's stomach twisted. He was starting to feel like they didn't believe him, like they were starting to suspect something he wasn't even aware of. "There's more to this, Jamal," the second officer said quietly, leaning in slightly. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in the area recently. People are talking about some shady deals going on. We just want to make sure you're not involved in something you don't understand." Jamal's mind raced. Shady deals? What could they be talking about? He didn't know anything about any shady dealings, and he definitely wasn't involved in anything illegal. He was just a regular kid trying to get by, doing his best to help out when he could. But now the police were implying something much bigger, something that didn't make sense. Is Mr. Henry involved in these deals? Jamal asked, his voice trembling despite his efforts to sound confident. I didn't think there was anything strange about him. The first officer looked at him for a long moment before answering. We can't say for sure yet, but we need to know everything, Jamal. Anything you remember could be important. Jamal's thoughts were a whirlwind. He had returned the wallet out of kindness, never imagining it would lead to something like this. He had no idea what was going on, but he was starting to feel like he had stepped into something much larger than he could handle. As the officers continued to ask him questions, Jamal's mind kept drifting back to Mr. Henry. The old man had seemed so harmless, so friendly. Could he really be involved in something criminal? And if he was, what did that mean for Jamal? Had he unknowingly gotten caught up in something dangerous? The officers stood up to leave, their questions still hanging in the air. We'll be in touch, Jamal, the first officer said, his voice leaving no room for argument. Don't leave town. Jamal stood frozen, watching them walk out the door. He didn't know what to think anymore. His life had suddenly been turned upside down, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something bad was about to happen. To be continued. Jamal sat in his room long after the police had left, trying to make sense of everything. His phone sat on the desk, buzzing occasionally with text messages from his friends, but he couldn't bring himself to answer. His mind was too tangled in the web the officers had spun, and his thoughts kept circling back to Mr. Henry. The old man's face, once warm and kind, now seemed shadowed with something Jamal couldn't explain. Was he part of something illegal? Had Jamal been drawn into something he didn't understand? He replayed the conversations in his head, analyzing every word the officers had said. Shady deals in the area, they had mentioned, but what did that even mean? And why had they specifically asked about the cash in the wallet? Jamal had never seen Mr. Henry with that much money before, but he had never thought to question it. Maybe the old man had fallen on hard times, or maybe it wasn't even his money. Could someone else have planted it there? But the more Jamal thought about it, the more confused he became. There was no clear reason why the police would be so interested in a lost wallet, no matter how much money it had in it. Was there something else they were hiding? Or was Jamal just being paranoid? His mind began to drift, and he thought about his own life, his family, and everything he had worked for. Jamal had always tried to keep his head down, do his schoolwork, and stay out of trouble. He didn't have time for drama or distractions, especially not now with graduation just around the corner. This wasn't how he had planned to spend his senior year. But now, it seemed like his world had been upended in ways he couldn't control. The sound of his mom calling him from the kitchen snapped him out of his thoughts. He dragged himself to the table, trying to mask the tension in his face as he joined her for dinner. She smiled at him, offering him a plate of food, but Jamal could see the concern in her eyes. She had noticed something was off. "You okay, Jamal?" she asked, her voice soft but probing. "Yeah, Mom. I'm fine," he replied quickly, but the lie hung in the air. He could feel it between them like an invisible wall. His mom wasn't buying it, but he didn't want to worry her, not yet. He knew how much she had sacrificed for him to be where he was, and he didn't want to drag her into this mess. "You don't seem fine," she pressed, setting her fork down. "You've been acting strange ever since those officers left." Jamal hesitated, then let out a sigh, the weight of the situation crashing down on him. "Mom, something's going on. I found a wallet yesterday and returned it to this old guy, Mr. Henry. But then the police showed up, and now they're asking about it like it's some kind of big deal." She frowned, clearly puzzled. "What do you mean? It's just a lost wallet." "I thought it was," Jamal said, shaking his head. "But they're asking about the cash inside. They think there's something weird going on, and I don't know why. It's just, something doesn't add up." His mom was silent for a moment, considering his words. "You know, Jamal, you're a good kid. You always try to do the right thing, but sometimes people don't see it that way. They make things harder than they need to be." Jamal stared at his plate, the tension in his chest tightening. He wanted to believe his mom's words, to feel like everything would work out. But the weight of the officer's questions kept pulling him back into the mystery. What if there was something more to Mr. Henry? What if returning the wallet had set off a chain of events he couldn't control? After dinner, Jamal excused himself to his room. He needed space, time to think, to process everything. But his thoughts were scattered, as though his mind couldn't settle on anything for long. He grabbed his phone and started searching for anything he could find about Mr. Henry. There had to be something, some clue that would explain why the police were so interested in the wallet, in the money inside it. He dug deeper, scrolling through local news stories, checking social media, and even searching for any criminal records or past incidents involving Mr. Henry. But everything seemed normal, at least on the surface. There was nothing obvious about the man that would have attracted the attention of law enforcement. Just as Jamal was about to give up, he found something that made his heart skip a beat. A news article from a few years ago caught his eye. It was a brief mention of an investigation into a string of robberies that had plagued the neighborhood. The victims, elderly people like Mr. Henry. The article didn't go into much detail, but it was enough to make Jamal's stomach churn. Could Mr. Henry have been a victim, or had he been involved in something more sinister? Jamal couldn't tell, but now he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The next day, Jamal decided he needed to talk to Mr. Henry again. He had to know what was going on. He couldn't keep living in this confusion, not when everything seemed so uncertain. But as he made his way to the old man's house, he felt a knot form in his stomach. What if he was wrong? What if he was getting too involved in something he shouldn't? When he knocked on the door, there was no answer. He knocked again, louder this time, but still nothing. The house was eerily silent. Jamal stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. His instincts told him to leave, but his curiosity pushed him forward. He tried the doorknob, and to his surprise, it turned easily in his hand. The door creaked open, revealing a dark and empty house. "Mr. Henry," Jamal called out cautiously as he stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, and the dim light filtering through the windows only added to the feeling of something being wrong. There was no sign of the old man, but there were signs that someone had left in a hurry. The furniture was slightly disturbed, as if it had been hastily moved. Papers were scattered across the table, and Jamal noticed something unusual. A small, leather-bound notebook partially hidden under a pile of books. His heart raced as he reached for it, flipping it open. The pages were filled with scribbled notes, names, and numbers. Some were crossed out, others circled. Jamal's eyes darted over the strange writing, trying to make sense of it. Was this some kind of code, or was it evidence of something darker? Before he could dig deeper, he heard a noise from upstairs. Footsteps. His blood ran cold. Was it Mr. Henry, or was someone else in the house? Jamal quickly shoved the notebook back under the pile and froze, holding his breath. The footsteps grew louder, coming closer. Then the front door slammed shut behind him. To be continued. Jamal's heart thudded in his chest as the sound of footsteps crept closer, each step sending a shockwave of panic through him. He stood frozen, holding his breath, praying whoever it was wouldn't find him in the house. The walls seemed to close in around him, the silence amplifying his every movement, his every thought. The footsteps paused for a moment, then continued down the hallway toward the stairs. Jamal's mind raced. Who could it be? Mr. Henry? Or someone else? Could it be someone connected to the shady deals the police had mentioned? His eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape route. The back door? No, it would be too obvious. He was trapped. His pulse quickened as the footsteps reached the top of the stairs. The house was still, except for the muffled sounds above. Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that whoever was upstairs knew he was here. Maybe they had seen him when he'd entered. Maybe he was walking into a trap, but he couldn't leave. Not now, not when he was so close to uncovering the truth. Jamal's eyes locked on the door to Mr. Henry's study at the end of the hallway. The door was slightly ajar, and he could see the faint outline of a shadow moving just beyond it. The notebook, his only clue, was hidden somewhere in that room. He had to get to it. He had to find out what Mr. Henry was hiding before it was too late. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. He glanced over his shoulder one last time, making sure the hallway was clear. With slow, deliberate steps, he made his way down the hall, each creak of the floorboards under his feet sending a shiver down his spine. The shadow in the study grew closer, but Jamal didn't dare look back. He couldn't afford to be caught. As he reached the door, a cold gust of wind blew through the open window, rattling the blinds. Jamal pushed the door gently, inching it open just enough to slip inside. The study was dimly lit, but he could make out the outline of Mr. Henry's desk, cluttered with papers and books. It smelled musty, as though the room hadn't been used in a while. Jamal's eyes fell to the desk, and his heart nearly stopped. The notebook was gone. Panic surged through him. Had someone already taken it? Or had Mr. Henry hidden it somewhere else? He couldn't afford to waste time. He began searching the room in a frenzy, pushing books aside, checking drawers. His hands trembled as he rifled through the papers, but there was nothing. No notebook, no clue. The footsteps grew louder again, closer, and Jamal knew he couldn't keep searching. Someone was almost at the door. He needed to get out, and fast. He darted across the room, moving toward the window, trying to stay as quiet as possible. His hands grasped the sill, and for a brief moment, he considered climbing out, escaping into the night. But then he heard a voice, a low murmur coming from just outside the study. It was unmistakable. Jamal? The voice was familiar, but Jamal couldn't place it immediately. His breath caught in his throat. It was Mr. Henry's voice, but it didn't sound like the kind, gentle man he'd spoken to the day before. It was cold, flat, almost as if the old man was a stranger. Jamal froze, his hand still gripping the window ledge. He couldn't believe it. Mr. Henry was right there, on the other side of the door. Was this all a setup? Had the old man known Jamal would come? Was this part of something bigger? A trap? Jamal's mind raced with questions, but there was no time for answers. The door creaked open slowly, and Jamal's eyes widened in horror. Standing in the doorway was Mr. Henry, his face expressionless, his eyes cold. And behind him, a figure emerged from the shadows. A tall, broad-shouldered man, dressed in all black, his face obscured by a hood. Jamal's heart raced as the man stepped forward, his heavy boots thudding against the floor. Mr. Henry didn't move. His gaze locked on Jamal, unreadable. It was clear now. This wasn't a simple misunderstanding. The police hadn't been wrong. There was something dangerous happening here. Something Jamal had stumbled into without realizing it. "You shouldn't have come here," Mr. Henry said, his voice low and measured. Jamal's mind raced. He wanted to run, but he knew it was too late for that. He had no idea who these people were or what they were involved in, but it was clear they had been waiting for him. The man in black took another step forward, and Jamal instinctively backed away, his mind scrambling for an escape. "You've seen too much," the man said in a low growl. His voice was rough, like he'd been speaking for hours. Jamal could feel the tension rising, the air thick with danger. "What do you want from me?" Jamal managed to choke out, his voice trembling despite his best efforts to stay calm. His eyes flicked toward the window again, but it was too late. There was no way out. Mr. Henry didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced at the man beside him, then back at Jamal. The silence hung heavy in the air, thick with unspoken truths. "You were never supposed to find that wallet," Mr. Henry said finally, his voice carrying an edge of finality. "It was never meant for you." Jamal's confusion deepened. "What are you talking about?" He took a step back, but the man in black blocked his path. He had no choice now but to face the two of them. The man in black reached into his coat and pulled out a small, shiny object. Jamal couldn't quite make it out in the dim light, but he felt a chill run down his spine when he realized it was a gun. "You don't understand, do you?" the man said, his voice colder now. "You've stumbled into something you can't just walk away from." Jamal's mind was a whirlwind of fear and confusion. He hadn't meant for any of this to happen. He hadn't asked for any of this. All he'd wanted was to return a lost wallet. But now he was standing face to face with danger he couldn't even comprehend. Mr. Henry stepped forward, his eyes never leaving Jamal's. "You're in over your head, boy. This is bigger than you think. And now, you're part of it." The door slammed shut behind him, and Jamal's breath caught in his throat. There was no way out. To be continued. The gun in the man's hand gleamed under the dim light, and Jamal's heart raced. Each beat like a hammer on his chest. He had no idea what was happening, but he knew one thing for sure. He was in deep. His mind scrambled for a way out, any way to escape the deadly situation he had found himself in. But as the seconds ticked by, he realized there was no simple answer. He was trapped. "Please," Jamal said, trying to keep his voice steady, but the fear was evident in every word. "I don't know what you want from me. I just returned a wallet. I didn't ask for any of this." Mr. Henry's eyes narrowed, his gaze cold. "It's too late for apologies, boy. You've already crossed a line. Now, you're involved whether you like it or not." Jamal's mind raced, trying to make sense of Mr. Henry's cryptic words. Asterisk crossed a line, asterisk what line? He just returned a lost wallet, for crying out loud. Why were they acting like he was part of some criminal conspiracy? But before he could speak again, the door behind him suddenly flew open with a force that rattled the walls. Both men froze. Their attention snapped toward the new arrival. Jamal spun around, confusion and fear turning to shock. Standing in the doorway, breathing heavily, was none other than Officer Blake, the same officer who had interrogated Jamal just the day before. "You're making a mistake," Officer Blake said, his voice low and controlled. His eyes were fixed on the man in black, but there was a tension in his stance that made Jamal's gut twist. Officer Blake wasn't here to help. He was here for something else. Jamal could feel it. The man in black grinned, though the expression didn't reach his eyes. "A mistake? I don't think so. You should know better than anyone that things aren't always what they seem." Blake's hand hovered near his belt, but it wasn't clear if he was reaching for his weapon or something else. The tension in the room thickened, and Jamal's heart skipped a beat. It felt like a standoff, but it wasn't between him and the man in black anymore. It was between the two of them, Officer Blake and the stranger, and Jamal was just the unfortunate pawn caught in the middle. "Stay back, kid," Officer Blake warned, his voice suddenly hard and cold. It was the first time Jamal had heard him speak with such an edge, but there was something unsettling about his tone. Was Blake part of this? Had he been in on whatever Mr. Henry was involved in all along? Was this all a setup from the beginning? Jamal's mind raced with possibilities, each more chilling than the last. Before Jamal could say anything, the man in black laughed softly, like he found the whole situation amusing. "You think you can stop us, Blake? You don't even know who you're dealing with." Blake's jaw clenched, and for the first time, Jamal saw a flicker of fear. Or was it guilt? In the officer's eyes. That fleeting moment told Jamal everything he needed to know. Officer Blake wasn't just here as a lawman. He was caught in this web too. But just as Jamal was starting to piece together the reality of the situation, a new voice broke through the tension like a knife cutting through the silence. "Enough." It was a woman's voice, sharp and commanding, and Jamal spun toward the sound. A figure stepped into the doorway, silhouetted by the dim light behind her. She was tall, dressed in dark clothes, and her presence was both authoritative and terrifying. There was no mistaking it. This woman had power, and she wasn't here to make small talk. "Clara," the man in black muttered, his demeanor shifting. The smirk on his face faded into something far more cautious. Clara's gaze swept over the room, taking in Officer Blake, Mr. Henry, and finally resting on Jamal. She didn't seem the least bit surprised to see him there. In fact, she looked almost relieved. "I told you not to get involved," she said, her eyes narrowing slightly as she focused on Jamal. "You really shouldn't have returned that wallet. Now look where we are." Jamal's head spun. This was all happening too fast. Clara, whoever she was, knew about the wallet, and worse, she seemed to know about him. How? Why? "I didn't have a choice," Jamal shouted, his voice rising. He was beyond scared now. He was angry. "I didn't know what was going on. I just did what I thought was right." Clara's expression softened, but it was only for a moment. She stepped further into the room, her heels clicking against the floor with each step. She didn't seem concerned by the gun or the standoff between the men. She was calm, too calm. "You think returning a lost wallet is an innocent thing, don't you?" Clara said, her tone almost patronizing. "You think you did a good deed, that you helped someone. But you didn't. You walked right into a game you don't understand, and now there's no going back." Jamal's mind reeled. Was she saying he was somehow complicit in whatever Mr. Henry and these people were involved in? Was he really just a pawn in someone else's game? Officer Blake spoke up then, his voice tight. "Clara, we've already been through this. You don't have to involve him. He's just a kid." Clara's eyes snapped toward him, and for a split second, Jamal thought he saw something cold and calculating in her gaze. "I do have to involve him, Blake. You don't understand. He's a liability now." The words sent a chill down Jamal's spine. A liability? What did that mean? His head was spinning, and his breath felt shallow. Was this all a setup from the start? Had Mr. Henry just been playing him the entire time? Had the officers known about it? Were they all in on something much bigger? "You'll understand soon enough, Jamal," Clara continued, her voice dangerously calm. "But for now, you need to stay out of this. Get out while you still can." Jamal's head was buzzing with the weight of it all. He couldn't think. His mind was a jumbled mess of confusion, fear, and anger. But before he could react, the man in black stepped forward, closing the gap between them. "If he stays," the man said, his voice low and threatening, "he'll be part of this, whether he wants to be or not." Jamal took a step back, his eyes darting between Clara, the officer, and the man in black. He was out of his depth, and the stakes were higher than ever before. He had to make a choice: stay and fight for answers, or run, and risk being dragged even deeper into whatever this was. The room felt smaller. The air felt thicker. And Jamal knew that his decision now would decide everything. To be continued. Jamal's heart was pounding, his mind a swirling mess of confusion, fear, and the weight of decisions that seemed far too heavy for someone his age. The room felt like it was closing in on him, the tension almost unbearable. He was trapped in a dangerous game, and no matter what choice he made, it seemed like he would lose. But one thing was clear: he couldn't stay frozen. He had to make a decision. "Jamal." Clara's voice cut through the chaos like a blade, sharp and cold. "You don't have time. If you're going to survive this, you need to leave. Now." Her words hung in the air, heavy with finality. Jamal could feel the weight of them, but something inside him snapped. No more running. No more letting others control his fate. He wasn't some pawn in their twisted game. Not anymore. "I'm not going anywhere," Jamal said, his voice steady despite the fear that gripped him. He looked directly at Clara, the woman who seemed to know everything, who held all the cards. "You're going to tell me what's really going on. All of it. Now." Clara's eyes flickered with something, a mix of surprise, maybe even respect. But before she could respond, Officer Blake took a step forward, his face a mask of desperation. "Jamal, you don't understand," Blake said, his voice softer now, as though he was pleading with him. "This is bigger than you. You're in too deep. You don't know who you're dealing with." Jamal's gaze didn't waver. He could see the fear in Blake's eyes, but that only made him more determined. "You're telling me I'm in too deep? You're the one who showed up at my house, trying to intimidate me. What is this? What have you been hiding?" Clara's expression darkened, and the room seemed to grow colder. "It's too late for questions, Jamal. You should have stayed away when you had the chance. Now, you've seen too much." Jamal's pulse quickened. "What are you talking about? What have I seen?" For a moment, the room was dead silent. The air felt thick with secrets, each person holding something back. It was Clara who finally spoke, her voice quiet but carrying a weight that sent a chill down Jamal's spine. "You think this is about a lost wallet?" Clara asked, her eyes narrowing. "It's not. The wallet was just a catalyst, a small piece in a much larger puzzle." Jamal's mind raced. A catalyst, he didn't understand. The wallet had seemed so simple at first, just a lost item to return. But now, Now it was a part of something he couldn't even fathom. What puzzle? Jamal demanded. Clara let out a sigh, her eyes flickering toward Officer Blake before she turned back to Jamal. You've been part of an investigation for months, Jamal. You just didn't know it. Jamal's stomach dropped. Asterisk investigation? Asterisk. He felt a cold wave of realization crash over him. This was no ordinary situation. This wasn't just some random crime. What do you mean? What investigation? Blake stepped back, his face grim. It's about money laundering, weapons deals, corruption at the highest levels. Mr. Henry's been involved in all of it, and we've been trying to bring him down. Jamal blinked, unable to process the words. Mr. Henry? The kind old man who had seemed so harmless. The man who had only asked him to return a lost wallet? It didn't make sense. You're lying, Jamal said, shaking his head in disbelief. Mr. Henry? He's not like that. He's just an old man. Clara's expression hardened. You have no idea who he really is. He's been playing you, Jamal. He knew you'd return the wallet, knew you'd get involved. And now you're part of this mess, whether you like it or not. The words hit Jamal like a punch to the gut. It was like a veil had been lifted, revealing a truth he wasn't ready to face. He could feel his hand shaking. Asterisk had he really been manipulated this entire time? Asterisk. Mr. Henry stepped forward, his cold eyes now fixed on Jamal. I gave you a chance to walk away, but now you've seen too much. You'll never be safe again. But just as Jamal's mind spun with the weight of everything, something unexpected happened. A loud bang echoed from outside, followed by the sound of multiple voices shouting. Before anyone could react, the front door to the house was kicked open, and several officers flooded the room, guns drawn. Jamal's eyes widened as he recognized the officer leading the charge. It was Officer Adams, the one who had been so adamant about Jamal's safety the day before. Get down, Officer Adams shouted, pushing Jamal to the ground, his voice urgent. This is a raid. Everyone, stay where you are. The scene erupted into chaos. Mr. Henry and the man in black moved swiftly, reaching for weapons hidden under their coats, but the officers were faster. Shots rang out in quick succession, and Jamal instinctively ducked, his heart in his throat. The world around him seemed to blur as he heard shouts, the sound of gunfire, and the rush of footsteps. As Jamal lay on the floor, trying to make sense of the madness unfolding around him, he caught a glimpse of Clara, her face now twisted with fury. She turned toward Mr. Henry and the man in black. This isn't over, she hissed, before disappearing into the fray. For a moment, Jamal was stunned. The officers had come for them. They were here to take down Mr. Henry and his associates. But even in the midst of the chaos, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Something wasn't right. Why had they all waited so long to make their move? Why had they let him get so close? As the gunfire subsided and the room fell silent, Jamal slowly got to his feet, still trying to process everything that had just happened. Officer Adams approached him, her expression hard. Are you all right? She asked, her voice softened, though her eyes remained sharp. I think so, Jamal stammered, his mind still racing. We need to talk, Officer Adams said, her voice low. But first, there's something you need to know. What you saw tonight, it's just the tip of the iceberg. And you've been caught up in something much bigger than you realize. Jamal's stomach twisted. Just when he thought it was over, just when he thought he had the answers, he realized the truth was far darker than he could have ever imagined. He was no longer just a boy who had returned a lost wallet. He was a part of a much larger story, one that was far from over. The twist was yet to come. The game had just begun. To be continued. Jamal stood there, his body still trembling from the adrenaline, the weight of everything that had just happened pressing down on him. He could hardly believe it. The chaos, the gunfire, the raid, none of it made sense. But Officer Adams, standing in front of him now, her face unreadable, made it clear that he was far from finished in this twisted story. We need to talk, she repeated, more firmly this time, her eyes never leaving his. But before you get any more confused, let me set the record straight. Jamal nodded slowly, his mind racing. He was exhausted, but at the same time, there was a burning curiosity inside him, a need to understand what had really happened. What had he walked into? What was it about the wallet, about Mr. Henry, that had dragged him into something so dangerous? Adams motioned for him to follow her as she led him out of the room, away from the wreckage of the raid. The sounds of officers securing the building and taking down the remaining suspects faded as they walked into a quieter part of the house. "Sit down," Officer Adams said, pointing to a chair. She took a seat across from him, her face softened slightly now, but still intense. "I know this doesn't make sense, Jamal. But everything you've been through was part of a much bigger operation, one that's been going on for months, maybe even years." Jamal sat down, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He could feel the sweat on his palms, the tension in his chest. What operation? What was all of this about? Adams exhaled slowly, clearly weighing her words before she spoke. "It's about a criminal network. Not just drug trafficking or robbery. This goes deep, Jamal. Money laundering, illegal weapons deals, the kind of things that corrupt entire governments. Mr. Henry, the man you thought was just an old man, was part of it. He's been the front for a much larger syndicate, one that's been operating under the radar for years." Jamal blinked, the shock of the revelation settling in. "But why me? Why was I dragged into this? I didn't even know what I was getting into." Adams gave him a sympathetic look, but her tone was firm. "Because you were chosen asterisk, and not just because of the wallet. You were already being watched, Jamal. The whole thing was a setup, but you didn't know that. You got involved by simply doing what anyone would do, returning something that didn't belong to you. That's what made you the perfect candidate for them to manipulate." Jamal's heart sank. Asterisk watched. Asterisk manipulated. Asterisk, he couldn't believe it. All of this, the fear, the confusion, the close calls, had been part of someone else's plan all along. He hadn't been just a bystander. He had been a tool, a pawn in a larger game. "I don't understand," he said, his voice cracking. "I thought I was just helping someone. How could I be watched? I'm just a kid from the neighborhood." Officer Adams leaned forward, her eyes locked onto his. "You're not just any kid, Jamal. You have potential. You're smart, resourceful, and they saw that. They needed someone like you to get close to their operation, to gather information without drawing attention. That's why they let you think you were just doing a good deed. But you weren't. You were part of their plan from the very beginning." Jamal shook his head, feeling a mix of anger and confusion. "So, I was never supposed to just help someone. The wallet, it was all a lie." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she glanced toward the doorway, as if making sure no one was listening. When she spoke again, her voice was low, almost apologetic. "It wasn't a complete lie. The wallet was real. It belonged to someone who had been involved in the operation, someone who had information that Mr. Henry's group needed to keep buried. They knew that if you found it, you'd get too close to the truth. But you weren't meant to discover anything, not until it was too late." Jamal felt a heavy silence fall between them. He could hardly wrap his mind around the enormity of what had just been revealed. He had been a part of something much bigger than he could have ever imagined. And what's worse, he had been set up, used to unknowingly gather information and get close to a dangerous network. "So, what happens now?" Jamal asked, his voice low. "Am I in danger?" Adams looked at him for a long moment before speaking. "You're not in danger anymore. The raid we just did, that was the beginning of taking down this entire syndicate. Mr. Henry is only one piece of the puzzle, but we've got leads now, real evidence. And with the intel you've unknowingly gathered, we're one step closer to dismantling this operation for good." Jamal felt a wave of relief wash over him, but it was quickly replaced with a gnawing sense of loss. He couldn't shake the feeling that, despite everything, there was still something he didn't fully understand. "And what about me?" he asked, more quietly now. "Am I just supposed to go back to my life? After all of this?" Officer Adams hesitated before answering, her expression softening for the first time. "You'll have to decide that for yourself. We'll help you, Jamal. We'll make sure you're safe. But this, it changes things. You'll never look at the world the same way again. But you have an opportunity here, one most people never get. You've seen the dark side of what people can do, and now you can make a choice. Do you walk away and leave it behind, or do you use what you know to make a difference? Jamal stared at her, thinking about the choices ahead. The old Jamal, the one who had just been trying to survive, would have run, would have walked away, tried to forget everything. But he wasn't that kid anymore. This had been his wake-up call, a reminder that life wasn't just about getting by. There was a bigger picture, a world that needed changing, and he was a part of that now. I don't know what the future holds, Jamal said slowly, looking out the window at the city beyond. But I know I can't just ignore it. I can't just walk away and pretend I didn't see any of this. Adams nodded, a faint smile crossing her lips. Good. That's the first step. As the night wore on and Jamal stood up to leave, the weight of everything that had happened hung heavy in the air. But for the first time, he felt a sense of purpose. He wasn't just some pawn in someone else's game anymore. He was a player, a force for change. And as he walked out into the night, the world didn't seem as dark as it once had. There were things he couldn't control, things that were bigger than him. But there were also things he could fight for, things worth living for. The wallet had been the key to unlocking it all. But the real question was, what would he do with what he learned? Jamal didn't have all the answers. But one thing was certain. The story wasn't over. It had only just begun.